Alright, welcome to 6.2 about natural selection. So far we've introduced evolution and we talked about the different theories, the difference between essentialism, which states that everything just exists the way it's always existed and nothing changes. Lamarckian evolution, which states that organisms can pass down their acquired characteristics, so that what happens to the adults over their lifetime, things like getting scars or losing limbs or something like that, could be passed on to their offspring. And then finally Darwinian evolution, which states that organisms of the same species have to compete for survival and to reproduce, and then it's that competition which causes change in the species. So today we're going to investigate the sort of the mechanism of it a bit better, the natural selection. No, you should work. Okay, so natural selection then, the mechanism for evolution. We're trying to explain how and why species change over time. The idea that species change over time is not really debatable. We have lots and lots of evidence, even just within human history. Even in our modern current events, the development of a new virus is an example of species changing over time. So we know it happens. Trying to explain what the cause of it is what natural selection is for. This image here just shows some different species of finches across different islands, and you can see they're all descended from an original ancestor species that probably got blown around by a storm or something like that. But each island had different food, insects and nectar, or insects under bark here, or nectar from flowers, digging under the bark for beetles, crushing seeds, or again nectar from flowers. And so they ended up with different bill designs in order to allow them to better access their food properly. So, in order for this to work, there has to be variation. You can't really have natural selection if all the organisms of the species are all identical to one another. A variation is an inherited trait that makes organisms different as a result of mutations, changes in DNA. Variations do not have to be positive things. I wear glasses. Having poor eyesight is a variation. It's definitely not one that would help me survive in an apocalyptic situation. The ones that are helpful we call adaptations. So variations can be anything. They can be positive or negative. They're just ways that one organism is different from another. Adaptations are all good for the organism. They're all beneficial. And down here we're just seeing some example of human variation. There's lots of variations in things like skin tone, hair textures, height, weight, eye colors, all sorts of stuff like that. But we're all still members of the same species. We have a lot of variation within a single species. So there's 4 key principles then for natural selection. In order for it to work, these 4 things have to be true. First of all, they have to have sexual reproduction that creates unique offspring. Here we have a litter of kittens. They could have the same mom and dad, but they all end up different from one another. Same thing with a litter of puppies. If there weren't unique offspring, if all the offspring ended up exactly like their parent, natural selection would not have much to work with, because you can't, if you're just competing against identical twins, it'd be harder to define winners and losers. Then these variations have to be genetic. Variations that occur as a result of lifestyle or life events are not going to be passed down to our offspring. And so the variations that are going to be, the evolution is going to apply to, have to be genetic variations. At least partially genetic. Some of them might be influenced by genetics but have more to do with their lifestyle. They have to be inheritable. So here we're looking at pictures of snails. This is one species of snails with a wide range of colors of shells. And you can see that if there's some that, like maybe brown snails do better, if they live in mud, over time you'd end up with more brown snails. And maybe the ones that don't help, the pale shells that make them stick out and get eaten by birds, maybe those eventually disappear from the population. So then we have competition. As a rule, organisms left uncontrolled will have more offspring than they can actually support. If you start with just 2 cats, you can end up with, I did the math for this once, over like 6 months you can end up with tens of thousands of cats, because they'll grow up and reproduce. It's worse with something with a shorter lifespan like rats. And then there are some variations which will help them survive, like having dark fur color here for the rats, and some variations, like being albino here, which probably won't help it survive. And the variations which are helpful, which are adaptations, will end up more common in the next generation because those are the survivors. And so we end up with selection. Helpful variations become more common over time. Here we're looking at what happened to horses. Like the oldest ancestors of horses are actually very, very small animals, roughly the size of dogs. with 4 toes on their feet, just like most mammals. Then as they moved out into the grasslands, they started getting taller and had lost toes. Ended up 3 toes here. We started seeing changes in their teeth as they adapted to eating grasses. Even taller here, 26 million years ago. 3 toes, but with 1 dominant single toe in the center. More teeth grazing adaptations. And then finally modern horses 3 million years ago on a single toe and like heavily adapted jaws for chewing grass. Same thing with antibiotic resistance. After you apply antibiotics, only the ones with the highest level of resistance survive. They make more bacteria, and the new population is all highly resistant. This is just another diagram sort of showing these things. Reproduction. You know, we have caterpillars making tons and tons of, moths making tons and tons of caterpillars. They grow up to make more moths. There's some variation, changes in their color. If there's competition, like predation, you know, if some of them are easier for the predators to find, then the ones that aren't easy to find become more common. Okay, so what does this do? We can apply these to a single gene trait, and what happens there is that it changes the allele frequencies. Alleles are like capital B here for black and capital R for red, and if you have both, you have incomplete dominance with brown BRs. So on red clay, the R's are the more common allele, 60% of them. Blacks are rare, only 10%, because they stick out more and they get eaten. If there's an ash fall, though, all of a sudden the red ones stick out like sore thumbs. And so we're seeing a change in the percentages, and by generation 3, most of the losers are black. With polygenic traits, it's a bit more difficult, because instead of being either or, being red or black or brown, they have to have this whole range of things like height here, or weight, and all these could potentially be polygenic traits. So what we're seeing here is what's called a bell curve, where most organisms are more or less average. If you map out the heights of everybody, most people's heights fall into an average sort of range, and you have very few at the extremes, you know, over 8 feet tall or under 3 feet tall. Most of us are between 5 and 6 feet tall. And so we call that the bell curve. And what we're going to see is that as we apply pressure, selective pressure to these species, we can change the shape of the curves. There's 3 different types of that we can do. There's directional selection, where individuals at one end are being selected against. So the ones that, you know, here's our original population. If all the ones that are dark, we're going to call this side the darker ones, if all the darker ones get killed, it shifts the whole bell curve to the left here, and they end up with paler moths over time. Directional. You can also imagine this with height. If humans were forced to get their food from trees, and only the taller humans could survive and reach the trees, then
I can't, Rocket. I have a fucking meeting.
I'll take care of him.
Well, he's trying to go right now. Rocket.
Sorry about that. I had to take a break for my dog. Okay, so directional selection. One extreme is being selected against, either the biggest ones or the smallest ones. It's pushing the bell curve one way or the other. The other type is called stabilizing selection. With stabilizing selection, both extremes are being selected against. The ones that are too big and the ones that are too small are both going to be less likely to survive. Or the ones that are black and the ones that are white, as in these butterfly diagram down here. And what it ends up doing is it creates a skinnier, taller, narrower curve. There's less variation, and all the survivors fall within a pretty narrow range of that phenotype, their characteristics. So for example, maybe only the really orange ones actually do live, and so you end up with butterflies that are really just orange. Or just medium-sized wolves, if we're talking about the example here. And then finally, the strangest one is probably disruptive. For whatever reason, with disruptive selection, it's the average ones that are selected against. Maybe, for example, these butterflies live in a forest where there's white flowers and there's blue flowers. And if there's white flowers, the white butterflies can hide there. And if there's blue flowers, the blue butterflies can hide there. But there's no place for light blue butterflies to hide. The ones that are in the middle, they stand out too much in both scenarios. And so the average ones get selected against. And you end up developing 2 distinct phenotypes. They're either white or blue, and you don't see many that are in between. This can, over time, lead to the development of new species. Okay, here's yet another picture showing what can happen with mice. You can have stabilizing selection, where all the mice end up more or less the same, and they don't have a whole lot of genetic variation, because there was selection against both sides. That's what these downward arrows show. With directional selection, you're just pushing the phenotype one way. These mice are all getting darker over time. There's selection against the lighter colored mice. Or with disruptive selection, you have selection against the average, and so you end up with two distinct groups of mice, dark-colored and light-colored mice, but none that are in the middle. So for your homework today, you're going to be reading different scenarios and determining which of these three types of selection are occurring. Is it stabilizing, directional, or disruptive? I hope this video helped. Anyway, thanks for your time, and I'll talk to you again next Tuesday.